Mrs. Rosalind, a widow in her late 30s, pushes a cart filled with discounted groceries. She glances at her watch, anxiety etched on her face. Mrs. Rosalind had always been a fighter. After losing her husband 2 years ago to a sudden illness, she had found herself navigating the treacherous waters of single parenthood alone. With 2 children to care for and bills piling up, every trip to Walmart felt like a battle against time and finances. Today was no different. She had a strict budget to stick to, and every dollar counted. As she maneuvered through the aisles, she carefully selected items that were on sale, canned goods, pasta, and whatever fresh produce she could afford. She sighed as she picked up a box of cereal for her kids, hoping it would last until the next paycheck. Suddenly, chaos erupted in the aisle ahead. A well-dressed man stumbled and fell hard to the ground. Gasps filled the air as shoppers stepped back, unsure of what to do. Mrs. Rosalind's heart raced. She couldn't just stand there. "Someone call 911. He needs help," she shouted, rushing toward the man who lay sprawled on the floor. As she knelt beside him, she noticed he was clutching his chest, his face pale. "Sir, can you hear me? Stay with me." She placed her hand on his shoulder, trying to keep him conscious. A crowd began to form around them, but Mrs. Rosalind focused solely on the man. "Please, stay with me," she urged again. Moments later, 2 employees rushed in with a first aid kit while another had already called for an ambulance. The man's eyes fluttered open briefly as he looked at her, confusion mixed with gratitude. "Thank you. I thought I was done for," he managed to say before drifting back into unconsciousness. After what felt like an eternity, an ambulance arrived and took him away. Mrs. Rosalind felt a mix of relief and worry as she watched them load him onto a stretcher. She stayed at the hospital for hours, anxious to hear news about his condition. Finally, a doctor approached her. "He's stable now but will need some time to recover," he said. "You were very brave to help him." Mrs. Rosalind nodded, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I just did what anyone would do." As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from her daughter asking when she would be home. The weight of her responsibilities hit her all over again. A few days later, Mrs. Rosalind receives a call from the hospital. "Is this Mrs. Rosalind? We have someone here who wants to speak with you," said the voice on the other end of the line. Her heart raced as she wondered if it was about the man she had helped. "Yes, this is she. Please come down to room 204, the nurse instructed. Before we move on, please kindly hit the subscription button now if this story inspires you, thanks." When Mrs. Rosalind entered the room, she found Mr. Kelvin sitting up in bed, looking much better than he had days prior. He was still dressed in a hospital gown but wore a grateful smile that lit up his face. "You saved my life," he said sincerely. "I just did what I could," Mrs. Rosalind replied softly. Mr. Kelvin extended his hand toward her. "I'm Kelvin Miller. Thank you for being there when I needed someone." "Mrs. Rosalind," she introduced herself as she shook his hand. "Please, call me Kel," he insisted. "I owe you so much for your quick thinking." As they spoke, it became clear that Mr. Kelvin was not just any ordinary man. He was a successful entrepreneur who had built a multi-million-dollar company from the ground up. He shared stories of his struggles and triumphs over the years, and Mrs. Rosalind found herself captivated by his resilience. "I know what it's like to struggle," he confessed after sharing his story about losing his wife years ago in a tragic accident. "Let me help you with your children's school fees and provide some groceries for your family." Mrs. Rosalind hesitated, feeling pride swell within her but also recognizing how desperately she needed help. "You don't understand. I've lost everything. I'm just trying to provide for my kids." Kelvin looked at her with empathy in his eyes. "I do understand. Life can be cruel. But we can rise from the ashes if we have support. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that accepting help didn't mean she was weak, it meant she was human. "If you're sure. I would be so grateful," she finally said. Over the next few weeks, Kelvin kept his promise. He helped Mrs. Rosalind with her children's school fees and provided groceries that filled her empty pantry to the brim. More than just financial assistance, he offered friendship and understanding, something Mrs. Rosalind desperately needed. They began meeting regularly for coffee or lunch, sharing stories about their lives and forming a bond that neither had anticipated. Kelvin admired Mrs. Rosalind's strength as a single mother while she found inspiration in his determination to overcome loss. One day at lunch, as they sat across from each other at a small cafe near the hospital, Kelvin leaned in closer and said, "You know, I've been thinking, you have so much potential. Have you ever considered going back to school?" Mrs. Rosalind chuckled lightly but felt a pang of longing in her heart at the thought of pursuing her dreams again. "I used to want to be a teacher," she admitted quietly. "Then why not? You have experience raising kids, you could inspire so many others," he encouraged her. "But what about my responsibilities?" she countered, feeling overwhelmed at the idea of juggling school with parenting and work. "I can help you," he offered genuinely. "You don't have to do this alone." After weeks of contemplation and encouragement from Kelvin, Mrs. Rosalind finally decided to enroll in community college for evening classes while continuing her part-time job at a local diner during the day. The first day of classes was nerve-wracking as she walked into the lecture hall filled with younger students who seemed so much more confident than her. However, as the weeks went by, she found herself thriving in an environment where learning ignited her passion once again. Kelvin continued to support her throughout this journey, helping with childcare when necessary and cheering her on during exams and projects. Their friendship deepened into something more profound as they spent time together both academically and socially. Months passed, and Mrs. Rosalind excelled in her classes while managing her family life with newfound confidence thanks to Kelvin's support. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. One evening after class, they walked through a park nearby discussing their dreams and aspirations under the stars. "Thank you for believing in me," Mrs. Rosalind said earnestly as they sat on a bench overlooking a serene lake reflecting the moonlight. "I didn't just believe in you, I saw your potential from day one," Kelvin replied with sincerity. As their friendship blossomed into love over time, they faced challenges together, balancing work, studies, and family life, but they always found strength in each other. If this story really inspires you, please kindly hit the subscription. You will be notified when we drop another great and inspiring videos. A year later, after countless late nights studying and juggling responsibilities, Mrs. Rosalind graduated from community college with honors, a moment that felt surreal after everything she had gone through. As she stood on stage receiving her diploma, tears streamed down her face as she spotted Kelvin in the crowd cheering for her alongside her children who waved proudly. After the ceremony ended, Kelvin approached her with flowers in hand and an expression of pride on his face. "I knew you could do it," he exclaimed as he enveloped her in a warm embrace. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied softly, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. In that moment, surrounded by love and support from those who mattered most, Mrs. Rosalind realized how far she had come, from struggling widow to empowered woman ready to take on whatever life threw at her next. As they walked hand in hand out of the auditorium into their bright future together, Mrs. Rosalind reflected on how one fateful day at Walmart changed everything, the day she chose kindness over indifference and helped someone who would ultimately help her back. Life was unpredictable. It could be harsh but also beautiful when shared with others who cared deeply about one another. And so began their journey, two souls intertwined by fate, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead together. Thanks for watching. If this story really inspires you, please kindly hit the subscription button now.